She was 68 years old. No home, no husband. Just $10 folded in the pocket of her coat. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned ranger station, deep in the most desolate high country of the American West, where the nearest paved road sat 14 miles away. They said it wasn't safe. They said it had been condemned for decades, but there was one thing nobody knew. That locked inside that old log cabin, in a sealed metal cabinet that hadn't been touched in 53 years, was something with the power to tear her in two and put her back together, all in a single winter. And now, in the middle of a blizzard, the boots of a stranger are coming toward her door. She was 68 years old and homeless, no husband, no savings. Just $10 folded in the pocket of a coat she'd worn for 3 winters straight. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned ranger station, deep in the high country of the American West, in a wilderness so remote the nearest paved road sat 14 miles away. The Forest Service said it was unsafe. The county said it had been condemned for decades. But what nobody knew, what nobody could have known, was that locked inside that old ranger cabin, in a sealed metal cabinet that hadn't been touched in 53 years, was something that would break her open and put her back together, all in the same winter. This is the story of Cora Vance, and it doesn't begin in the mountains at all. It begins on a kitchen floor. 60 years before she ever set foot on that trail, she was 8 years old the first time her mother caught her doing it, sitting cross-legged on the cracked linoleum, a road atlas open across her small lap. The atlas was old even then, its spine split, its pages soft as cloth from handling. It smelled like dust and gasoline, and something faintly sweet underneath that she could never name. Her mother stood in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, watching her daughter drag one finger across the green spaces on the map: national forests, wilderness areas, the empty places, the places that didn't belong to anybody. "What are you doing down there, Cora?" Cora didn't look up. "Looking at where I'm going to live someday," her mother smiled, shook her head, went back to the sink, because Marin Vance was a practical woman. She kept the books at a lumber yard outside town. She believed in things you could count, things you could verify, things that stayed where you put them. And she thought her daughter's fascination with empty spaces was a phase, something she'd grow out of. It was not a phase. Here is the thing about Cora's father. She did not remember him. She was 4 years old when he left, and she did not remember his face, or his voice, or whether he'd ever held her, or read to her, or sat on the edge of her bed and made the dark seem smaller. All she had was a shape, a tall shape in a doorway, there and then, not there, and a smell, dust and gasoline and something sweet. The same smell as the atlas. She never made that connection as a child. Why would she? Her mother never spoke of him, except once. Cora asked the way children ask, blunt and without armor, "Where did my father go?" And Marin set down her cup and looked at her daughter for a long moment, and said 7 words that Cora would carry for the next 60 years like a stone sewn into her coat. "Some people just aren't built for staying." That was all. Some people aren't built for staying. And Cora, 8 years old, 9, 10. She turned those words over in the dark, and she wondered quietly, in the place where children keep the questions too big to say out loud. She wondered if she was one of them. Marin raised her alone, in a small rented house on a street where nothing ever happened. The lawns got mowed, the trucks got washed, the neighbors waved but never came inside. It was the kind of place Marin loved, because it was safe and predictable, and nothing in it would ever surprise her again. It was the kind of place Cora could not wait to leave. She was smart, bored. She finished her schoolwork in 15 minutes and then sat by the window, staring at the line of identical roofs across the street, wondering what was past them, past the edge of town, past the last road on any map she'd ever held. She read every survival book the small library had. Trappers, hermits, men who walked into the woods with an axe and a sack of flour and didn't come out for years. By 12, she'd read every Jack London story printed. She carried a paperback of Walden through high school and never once finished it. Found the man a little too pleased with himself, but she understood what he was reaching for. The longing for a place that was your own. A place nobody else wanted. A place quiet enough to finally hear yourself think. She started going into the mountains alone at 14. Took the county bus to the trailhead with borrowed gear. Walked in for 3 days at a stretch. She learned to read a topographic map. to filter water off a creek, to tell the berries that fed you from the ones that emptied you out, to start a fire in the rain, to hang food where the bears couldn't climb. Marin did not approve, but Marin also did not know how to stop her, because arguing with Cora was like arguing with weather. You could complain all you wanted. It was going to do what it was going to do, and the only choice you had was whether you brought a coat. By 17, she'd walked 800 miles of backcountry, mostly alone, mostly off-trail. She knew which passes held snow into July. She knew where the water ran cleanest. She knew a ridge where you could stand and see 50 miles in every direction, and not one single sign of another living soul. Up there, she felt like herself. Down here, she felt like a photograph of somebody. And then she grew up, because everybody grows up. She met a man named Roy Vance at a diner where she was waiting tables the summer she turned 22. Steady man, kind hands. A man who owned a small heating and cooling business 2 towns over, and had never once wondered what was past the last road, because he liked exactly where he was. She married him. She kept his name. And here is the part Cora spent 40 years not saying out loud. She loved Roy. She did, but there was a night. Just one. When their daughter Delphine was 4 years old, the same age Cora had been, and Delphine was sick with a fever that wouldn't break, and Roy was gone on a job 3 states over, and the house was too small and too hot and too full of a crying that would not stop. And Cora stood at the front door, hand on the knob, keys in her fist, the truck 20 feet away and half a tank of gas in it, and for one long, terrible, silent minute, she wanted to leave. She wanted to walk out that door and get in that truck and drive, until the houses ran out and the mountains started, and not come back. You already know the words that were in her head. She didn't leave. Not that night. She went back inside. She sat on the floor of the nursery and held her burning child until the fever finally broke near dawn, but something in her had seen the door open. And it never fully closed again. She stayed married. She stayed a mother. On paper, she stayed everything, but she was there the way a hand is there while the mind is somewhere else. Gentle, competent, and gone. Delphine grew up next to a mother who was always half looking out a window. And children know. Children always know. By the time Delphine was 17, she couldn't wait to leave either. Except she left toward people, toward noise, toward a busy city and a busy life, and a family of her own. The exact opposite of everything her mother reached for. She left and she stayed gone. Not with a fight. That would have been easier. It was quieter than that. A phone call every few months. A card at Christmas signed in a hand that got more distant every year. A grandchild Cora had met exactly twice, a slow drift like 2 boats. Same water, no rope. Roy died when Cora was 66 heart. Quick, he was fixing a furnace in somebody's basement, and he sat down on the concrete steps and told the homeowner he needed a minute. And the minute was the last one. And after the funeral, after the casserole stopped coming, after the phone stopped ringing, Cora stood in the middle of the house they'd shared for 40 years and understood a thing she had spent her whole life avoiding. She was alone. Completely alone. The business had been Roy's. It went with him. The house was rented. It had always been rented because Roy believed in cash and hated banks. The savings, what little there was, went to the last hospital bill and the funeral home, and the small mountain of paper that death leaves behind like snow. She was 66 years old, and she had $400 and a coat, and a daughter who took 3 days to return her call. For 2 years after that, Cora lived like a ghost. She cleaned motel rooms in a town where nobody knew her name, sleeping in the last unrented unit until the manager needed it back. She stocked shelves overnight at a grocery until her knees gave out on the concrete floor. She sat in libraries during the cold hours because libraries were warm and quiet, and nobody asked a gray-haired woman why she was there. She rode buses. She slept in bus stations. She carried everything she owned in one bag and a coat with 3 winters in the seams. And she was tired, not tired of living. That surprised her. She thought she would be. She wasn't. She was tired of being between things. Tired of the smell of other people's laundry. Tired of waking up somewhere different every week and never once knowing where she'd close her eyes the week after. She wanted to put the bag down. Not an apartment. Not a lease. Not a credit check that a 68-year-old woman with no income was going to fail anyway. She wanted somewhere remote. Somewhere hard. Somewhere hers. somewhere nobody else wanted, because the things nobody wanted were the only things she could afford. She found the listing in February on a library computer in a town called Ledger's Crossing. Scrolling through Forest Service surplus pages, the way some people scroll through old photographs. For the ache of it, the Forest Service sold off old buildings sometimes. Fire lookouts, work camps, ranger outposts they'd stopped using when the budgets changed and the maps got redrawn. Most got snapped up years ago. Weekend cabins. Stories to tell at dinner. But some just sat in legal limbo, too small, too remote, too tangled in old restrictions to draw a single bid. The one Cora found was a district ranger station. In a national forest she'd walked as a young woman, though she didn't know the parcel by name, used as a ranger outpost from 1927 to 1971. Then the service consolidated, closed the station, and it had sat empty ever since. 53 years of dust, and snow piling on the roof every winter and sliding off every spring, and no one there to hear it fall. The county had been trying to sell it at tax auctions since 2008. No takers. The asking price had dropped, and dropped, and dropped. $10. Cora stared at the screen. $10. She read it again, looking for the catch, because there is always a catch. Nothing costs $10, unless something is deeply structurally wrong with it. The catch was the access, 14 miles from the nearest paved road. 8 of those miles on a forest road closed to vehicles October through June for snow. The last 6 on a foot trail that climbed over a pass at 7,200 feet. No power, no water lines, no septic, no phone, no way in during winter but boots or skis. The nearest town was Ledger. Population 116. An hour from the trailhead, Cora looked at that listing for a long time. Then she opened a second window and found a topographic map of the area. And she found the little parcel. A small blue square in a sea of green, and she traced the trails that led to it, and measured the distances, and looked at where the creeks ran, and where the ridges made windbreaks, and which slopes faced south to catch the most sun. Her finger moved across the screen the way it had moved across an atlas 60 years before. And her hands, her old hands, steadied for the first time in 2 years. She was on a bus within the week. The bus dropped her in Ledger just past noon, and Ledger was barely a town at all. A main street, a general store, a gas station with 2 pumps, a diner, a scatter of houses along the road, smoke rising from a few chimneys, snow banked gray along the edges of everything. And behind it, the mountains, rising up like a wall of granite, their high peaks still heavy with the last of the winter snow so big. They made the little town look like something spilled at their feet. Cora ate at the diner, because she didn't know when she'd eat hot food again. A patty melt, a cup of coffee, a slice of pie she almost didn't order and was glad she did. The woman behind the counter ran the place alone, somewhere in her 60s. Silver hair pulled back tight, a face weathered into permanent good humor, and hands that had clearly worked every single day of a long life. Her name was Opal Beckett. Paul looked at Cora's pack by the stool, and her boots, and the map she'd spread beside her plate like a prayer she was reading. "Where you headed? On?" Cora told her. Opal's eyebrows went up, slow, like a drawbridge. "That old ranger station, that's the one." Opal set down the pot and looked at Cora a beat longer than was polite. "That place has been empty since before I got here, and I got here in 79. She wiped a hand on her apron. "That trail's not on any of the maps the hikers use. I don't know a living soul who's been up there in years." "That's kind of the point," Cora said. Opal studied her, and something passed behind the older woman's eyes. "Not worry, exactly. Recognition, maybe. You be careful up there," she said. "Mountain doesn't care how tough you are." "No," Cora said. "It never did." She left cash on the counter, more than the food cost. Opal watched her shoulder the pack and push out into the cold. After lunch, she caught a ride to the trailhead. The man driving was Walt, Forest Service. Retired, though he still drove the old green truck and still checked on things nobody paid him to check on anymore. He was older than he first looked. 70s, white beard, skin gone dark and grained as saddle leather from a life spent outdoors, and the deep, comfortable silence of a man who'd spent more years in the woods than out of them. Cracked windshield, mud on the fenders, a faded sticker on the bumper. Leave no trace. They didn't talk much on the drive. Walt wasn't the talking kind, but when the pavement ran out and the forest road began, he pulled over and he put the truck in park. And he looked at Cora with something in his face she couldn't read yet. He looked at her gear, her boots, the way she'd shouldered that pack without adjusting a single strap, like she'd done it 10,000 times. Which she had. "You know what you're doing," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I do." Walt nodded and looked out through the cracked glass at the mountains. And then he said the thing that stopped her heart. "That cabin you're headed to. It belonged to a man. District Ranger up there 13 years. 58 to 71. Cora waited. Something cold moving in her chest for no reason she could name. Fell a name of Silas Hartley. The name landed in her like a stone dropped down a well. And she waited. Waited to hear the splash at the bottom. To hear how far down it went. Because Silas Hartley was a name she had seen exactly once in her life years ago. Cleaning out her mother's things after Marin died. A single envelope in a shoebox at the back of a closet, addressed in a man's hand, to a little girl, returned to sender, stamped in red. Silas Hartley, the father she did not remember, the tall shape in the doorway, there and then not there. Cora did not say any of this. She had spent 60 years not saying things. She was very, very good at it. "What happened to him?" she asked, and her voice came out level. She was proud of that. Level Walt was quiet a moment, his jaw worked. Like the words cost him something, disappeared. Winter of 71. Right before they closed the station, he kept his eyes on the mountains. Some folks said he went north, a posting up in Alaska. That's what the paperwork claimed. And the other folks? Walt looked at her then. Direct and old and tired and holding something back the size of a mountain. The other folks said he never left these hills at all. The forest road stretched empty ahead of them into the trees. "They searched," Walt said. "I was young, but I remember. They searched all spring." He shook his head. Slow. Never found him. Never found so much as a boot. Or sat very still. 53 years. Her whole adult life. She had believed her father was a man who left. A man who wasn't built for staying. A man who got in a truck one day and drove until the houses ran out. And here was a stranger in a green truck, telling her he might have done the opposite. That he might have walked into these mountains and chosen never, ever, to leave. "You all right?" Walt asked. "Fine," Cora lied. Long bus ride, Walt didn't believe her, she could see that. But he was a man who let other people keep their secrets, which was maybe why she'd trust him later, though she didn't know that yet. "You be careful up there," he said. The same words Opal had used. Like the whole town knew a thing about that cabin, and only ever said it sideways. Cora got out, shouldered her pack, and started walking. The forest road climbed slow through stands of lodgepole and aspen, switchbacks up the side of a long valley. The snow was gone from the roadbed, but lingered in the shade in dirty granular patches, the last remnants of a hard winter. She walked at 1.5 miles an hour, the old pace. The pace that eats distance without eating you. Her body was 68, it complained, her knees on the downhills, her shoulders under the straps. A dull heat in the arch of her right foot, but it held, because this body had once walked 800 miles of backcountry. And a body remembers, even 60 years on. A body remembers what it was built to do. She crossed 2 creeks on old log bridges gone gray and soft-looking but still solid under her weight. She tapped each one, filtered water, rested her shoulders, listened to the sound of water moving over stone, a sound she had loved before she had words for love. She passed a burned scar from some fire decades gone. The dead trees standing silver against the sky, barks stripped, branches broken off till only the trunks remained, but at their feet, new growth, small pines, wildflowers, grass reaching up into the light the dead trees had finally let through. The mountains were always doing that, burning down, growing back, dying and being reborn in the same breath. She wondered, walking, whether a person could do the same, this late, at 68. With most of the light already behind her, she made camp that first night at the base of the pass. A flat spot beside a creek half locked in ice. She set her small tent, cooked rice and beans on a little stove, the last of the food she'd bought in Ledger, and she sat on a cold rock and watched the stars come out over the black granite ridge. First the bright ones, the planets, low and steady. Then the dim ones filling in behind them. Like someone walking through a vast dark house turning on lights, room by room by room. And then the whole river of it, poured across the sky from ridge to ridge. Cora tipped her head back. and she felt the thing she had felt every single time she'd looked at that sky since she was a girl on a linoleum floor, small and temporary and unimportant, but part of it, part of the rock and the water and the cold and the light. Part of all of it. It got below freezing before midnight. She'd been cold before. She slept in her layers with her water bottle tucked in the bag so it wouldn't freeze. And she slept the deep, heavy sleep of a body that has worked all day and is grateful past words for the rest. She woke at dawn to frost thick on the outside of the bag, her breath hanging white in the air, the eastern sky the color of the inside of a shell. She packed up, and she started to climb. The trail to the pass was steep, switchbacking up a north face that still held deep snow in the shadowed folds. In some places she had to kick steps into the crust and stomp them flat. In others the snow had melted and frozen to hard ice, and she moved slow, testing each step with her poles before she trusted her weight to it, because a fall up here didn't mean a scrape and a curse. A fall up here at 68, 14 miles from a road, meant something else entirely, and she knew it, and she was careful. She stopped twice to drink, once to eat a bar. She did not stop to rest. The pass sat at 7,200 feet, a narrow gap between two granite peaks, the wind always blowing through it. When Cora reached it, she was breathing hard and her legs burned, and sweat had soaked her base layer clean through despite the cold. She stopped at the top and turned and looked back the way she'd come. Mountains. Nothing but mountains. The valley she'd walked lay far below, a green ribbon, the creek a silver thread stitched through it. And beyond that, ridge on ridge on ridge, all the way to the horizon, where the earth met the sky in a line so clean it looked cut with a knife. She turned and looked the other way. More mountains. A different valley, broader, filled with pine and aspen, and the aspens just leafing out that first impossible green, so pale and so bright against the dark of the conifers that they looked like 10,000 small lanterns held up against the shadow. And somewhere down there, hidden in the trees, was the cabin, her cabin, the place she'd been looking at on maps since she was 8 years old on a kitchen floor. Except now it was more than that. Now it was his cabin too, the tall shape in the doorway, the returned envelope in the red-stamped shoebox. The man who might have walked into these very mountains and chosen never to come out. Cora stood on that pass with the wind tearing at her coat, and she did not know yet what she would find at the bottom of that trail. She did not know about the money, or the maps, or the 2 letters. One meant for anyone, and one meant for her. She only knew that her whole life had bent, without her ever once seeing it bend, toward this exact ridge on this exact morning. And she started down. The descent was easier than the climb. The south face held less snow. The trail dropped through high meadows, where the first flowers were pushing up before the snow had even finished melting around them. Glacier lilies, petals bent back like wings. Spring beauties, white with fine pink stripes. Pasque flowers in their fuzzy gray-purple clusters. She made decent time. By mid-afternoon she was down among the lodgepole, the trees tall and straight around her, bare for the first 20 feet the way lodgepoles grow, reaching, competing, climbing for the light, until their crowns finally break through and spread against the sky. She crossed one more creek on a log bridge that looked 100 years old and probably was. She bounced her heel on it, felt the wood give, not break, crossed, climbed a small rise, and there it was. The cabin sat in a clearing on a flat shelf of land above a creek. Dark-stained logs, a single story, a steep green metal roof built to shed the snow, a small covered porch on the south side, a stone chimney climbing the west wall, 3 windows on the front, a plain door, its brown paint chalky with the years. Above the door, a small carved wooden sign, too weathered to read from where she stood, and behind the cabin, half hidden in the trees, a tower, a fire lookout, maybe 60 feet tall, a small glassed cab at the top, a switchback ladder running up the leg of it, the whole structure leaning just slightly, but standing, still watching over the valley the way it had watched for the better part of 100 years. Cora stood at the edge of the clearing, and she did not move. The light was the color of old copper. The lodgepoles threw long shadows toward the east. A cold breeze slid down off the ridge and moved through the tops of the trees and made them sway. Slow, gentle, like they were nodding to her. Somewhere off in the distance, a raven called, and the sound carried impossibly far in the thin, clean air. This was it. The place she'd traced with one finger on a kitchen floor 60 years before, when she told her mother she was looking at where she was going to live someday, and her mother had smiled and shaken her head and thought it was a phase. It was not a phase. Cora walked across the clearing. The winter grass was tall and brown and caught at her boots, but she could see it, under the grass, the faint remnant of a path, worn into the ground. A path that led from the trees to the porch steps, a path walked thousands of times, tens of thousands, by the man who'd lived here, by Silas Hartley, who vanished in the winter of 1971 and was never found. The porch boards groaned under her boots. She stopped at the door, and now she could read the little carved sign above it, the letters just legible in the copper light, District Ranger Station. And below that, smaller, hand-cut by a knife rather than a chisel, two words that made the breath catch in her throat, Skill Home. She stood there a long moment, reading it again. Then she tried the handle, locked it. But the lock was old, and the wood around it was soft, gone punky with 53 years of weather. She set her shoulder against the door, an old woman's shoulder, and she pushed, steady, not with force she didn't have, but with patience she did. The latch gave with a small splintering crack, and the door swung inward. Inside was darkness. Inside was dust. Inside was 53 years of silence, standing in the air like water in a well. Cora Vance stepped across the threshold, into the cabin, into the cold, into whatever her father had left behind. The room was one large space, maybe 20 feet by 30. The floor rough-cut pine, dark with age but solid under her boots. The walls the same dark logs as the outside, the chinking mostly intact, the ceiling open to the rafters. A loft at one end, reached by a wooden ladder, a railing of peeled pine poles, the gray shape of an old mattress up there under a skin of dust. A stone fireplace filled the west wall, its mantel one great rough beam, worn smooth in the center where a hand had rested 1,000 times. Beside it a cast-iron cook stove, rusted in spots but whole, a heavy table in the middle of the room, two chairs pushed under it, a cot frame against the back wall, its canvas long rotted, its wood still sound, a bookshelf along the east wall, empty, waiting a small writing desk under one front window, set to catch the morning light, and everything, every surface, under a thick soft coat of gray dust that hung in the light and sparkled where the last of the sun came through the dirty glass. Everything looked exactly the way it had looked when the last person walked out. In 1971, Cora moved slow through the room, her boots leaving prints in the dust like footprints in fresh snow. She touched the table, dragged her fingers across it and left 4 dark trails, and then she saw the bookshelf wasn't quite empty. One book, fallen behind the bottom shelf, wedged in the shadow where it had slid decades ago. She crouched, old knees popping, and she worked it free. And when she turned it over in the dying light, her hands went cold. It was an atlas, a road atlas, old. The spine split, the pages soft as cloth, and it smelled. When she brought it close, it smelled like dust and gasoline and something faintly sweet underneath that she had spent 60 years trying to name and never could. It smelled like the atlas from her mother's kitchen floor, because it was the same atlas. She opened the front cover with hands that had begun, very slightly, to shake. And there, inside, in the top corner of the first page, in the careful, blocky, painstaking letters of a child just learning to write, was her own name, Cora. She sat down hard on the dusty floor of that abandoned cabin, 14 miles from the nearest road, 53 years into the silence, holding a book she'd last seen when she was 5 years old. The book that had vanished from her house the same year her father did. He hadn't left it behind. He'd taken it with him. He'd carried the atlas his daughter loved, up a 14-mile trail, over a 7,200-foot pass, into the deepest wilderness he could find, and he'd kept it. For 13 years, longer, he'd kept it here. Cora pressed the old book to her chest, in the dark, in the cold, and for the first time in 60 years, she wept. And she did not yet know that the metal cabinet, in the corner, just there, in the shadow beside the bookshelf, held everything. She wiped her face with the back of a dusty hand, and she looked up, across the dark room, and there in the corner, gray steel, 4 feet tall, 2 doors, a built-in lock, the cabinet, and above the door she'd broken open, hanging from a small nail, catching the very last of the copper light, a metal ring, with 3 keys on it. Cora got to her feet, and she walked toward the cabinet, slow, The atlas still held to her chest with one arm, her heart going hard against it, because whatever was in there, whatever her father had locked away and left behind, had waited 53 years for someone to find it. She reached up and took the ring of keys down off the nail. 3 keys, 2 old skeleton keys, and 1 small steel key, the kind that fits a metal cabinet. She tried it in the lock. The lock clicked open, a small sound, enormous in that silence, and she stood there, her hand on the handle, the key still in the lock, an old woman in a dead man's cabin, not moving because she did not know what was inside. Because for 53 years no one had known what was inside. Because once she opened it, she could not unopen it. She thought about that. Old people think about that. About the doors you can't close again. Then she pulled the handle. The cabinet doors swung open with a groan of old hinges, and Cora stopped breathing. Maps. Hundreds of maps stacked on the shelves in neat piles, organized by region, each one folded careful along its original creases. Topographic surveys, fire boundary maps, trail maps, hand-drawn routes on yellowed paper, survey maps thick with measurements and notes in faded pencil. She reached out and touched the edge of the nearest stack, the paper old, but sound, protected by the sealed cabinet from the damp and the freeze and thaw that had aged everything else. She drew out the top map, unfolded it in the failing light, a geological survey, 1934, original printing, the kind of thing collectors paid hundreds for, the kind of thing that belonged in a museum, not in an abandoned cabin 14 miles from a road. She put it back, drew out another, a hand-corrected fire response map, 1947. Someone had drawn on it in red pencil, fire lines, water sources, the handwriting neat and precise. The work of a man who understood that lives might hang on those marks. And the handwriting was the same on every corrected map, neat, blocky, painstaking. The same letters that spelled her name in the front of the atlas. She knew that hand now. She would know it anywhere. This was his life, decades of it. A man's whole quiet life, folded into steel and left in the dark. She was so lost in the maps, so far gone into that dead man's careful world, that she almost missed what was on the bottom shelf, almost. Except her hand brushed something that was not paper. Something soft, something heavy. She pushed the last stack aside and looked down into the shadow at the bottom of the cabinet. 3 canvas bags, tied with twine, the knots tight and deliberate, tucked behind the maps, hidden, placed there careful. Like a man wanted them, found only by someone patient enough to look through everything else first. Cora lifted the first bag and nearly dropped it, because it was heavy. Much heavier than it had any right to be. She set it on the floor and knelt beside it in the dust, her old fingers working at the knot, stiff with 53 years but not impossible. The twine loosened. The bag fell open. Money, old paper money, 20s and 50s, bound in stacks with paper bands, and each stack labeled a year in that same neat blocky hand. Cora did not touch it. She just stared. She opened the second bag. More money, more years. She opened the third. More. She sat back on her heels in the dark and looked at 3 open bags of money on the floor of an abandoned cabin she had bought for $10. The bills were old, their color faded, their edges soft, but they were real, and she started to count. It took her almost an hour. The light died as she worked. She did not stop to light a candle. She just counted, stack by stack, year by year, a running total climbing in her head. When she finished, she sat with her back against the cold cabinet. $39,800, almost $40,000, 13 years of a man's savings. 13 years of a life, converted to paper and locked in steel, and left behind when he walked out into the snow for the last time. And Cora did not feel rich. She felt sick, because a man does not leave $40,000 in a cabin he plans to come back to. A man leaves $40,000 behind. Only if he knows, now he is not coming back. She understood then, sitting on that floor in the dark. The money was not a fortune. The money was a goodbye. And that was when she saw the portfolio at the very back of the cabinet. Behind where the bags had sat, a leather portfolio, dark brown, the surface cracked and dry. She'd missed it in the shadow. She reached in and pulled it out, and untied the leather cord with fingers gone very still. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed, on Forest Service letterhead dated June 30th, 1971. Cora carried it to the window, where the very last of the day still held, and she read, "The next person who finds this cabin My name is Silas Hartley. I have served as district ranger of this station since 1958, when I was 27 years old. For 13 years, this cabin has been my home, and these mountains have been my responsibility. I have buried the dead from 3 search and rescue operations. I have watched more sunrises from this porch than I could ever count. I have loved this country with the kind of love that does not need explaining. The Forest Service is closing this station next month. They have offered me a desk in an office 200 miles from here. I have declined. The paperwork says I am moving to Alaska. That is what I have told my supervisors. That is what the record will show. But I do not know if I will ever leave these mountains. Cora's hand tightened on the page. I have thought about it a long time. About what it means to love a place so deeply, you cannot imagine yourself outside of it. About what happens to a man when the only home he ever chose is taken from him by people who have never stood on this trail, who do not know what they are destroying. I do not blame them, but I know something they do not. And I have decided that the mountains will make the final choice. I have saved a little from every paycheck for 13 years. I am leaving the money here, not for the Forest Service. They decided this place was no longer worth their attention, and I will not reward that decision with my savings. I am leaving it for whoever finds this cabin next. Anyone who walks 14 miles to reach this place. Anyone who opens this cabinet with the key I left hanging by the door has earned the right to whatever I leave behind. I will not choose who that is. I will trust the mountains to choose. The way I have trusted them for 13 years. Take care of the cabin if you can. The roof is good another 20 years if you keep the snow cleared. The wet west wind sticks in damp weather. Lift on the upper left corner as you push. There is a spring 100 feet north, behind a boulder shaped like a turtle. The water has never once run dry. This place taught me everything I know about being alive. I hope it teaches you too. Silas Hartley. June 30th, 1971. Cora read it twice, then she read it a third time. And the third time she read it, she was not reading a letter to a stranger anymore. She was reading her father's voice. For the first time in her life, she had no memory of it. Not one word. Not one syllable of the man who left when she was 4, and here he was, talking to her. Across 53 years, I do not know if I will ever leave these mountains. He hadn't gone to Alaska. Cora knew it the way you know a thing in your body before your mind agrees to it. The letter was a goodbye. The money was a goodbye. The knots were a goodbye. Her father had walked into the winter of 1971. On purpose, and the town knew. Walt knew. Opal knew. That was the thing they all said sideways. The mountain doesn't care how tough you are. You be careful up there. They weren't warning her about the trail. They were warning her about him. She folded the letter, and she started to slide it back into the leather portfolio, except the portfolio was not empty. There was a second envelope inside, tucked into a pocket she hadn't seen, smaller, yellowed, and on the front, in that same neat blocky hand, a single word. Cora. She stopped breathing again because that made no sense, because Silas Hartley wrote his open letter to whoever the mountains chose. He said so. He said he would not choose, he would leave it to chance. To the trail. To the 14 miles. He could not have known who would come. He could not have written her name on an envelope in 1971, when she was 15 years old, 2,000 miles away, when she had no idea he existed as anything but a shape in a doorway. He could not have known. And yet, her name was on the envelope. In his hand, Cora's fingers were shaking now. Bad enough she had to press the envelope flat against the desk to open it. Inside. Not a letter. Not at first. A photograph. A small square photograph gone soft and gray at the edges. A young woman on a porch step, squinting into the sun. A toddler on her lap. The toddler had a stubborn set to her small jaw. Cora knew the young woman. It was her mother, Marin, young. Impossibly young. Before the lumber yard and the ledgers and the 7 words about staying, and the toddler on her lap, was Cora, on the back, in pencil. In his hand. Cora, age 2. She turned back to the envelope. There was more. Folded small behind where the photograph had been. Another sheet, older than the open letter. Handwritten. A private thing. She unfolded it. Cora, it began. You will not remember me. I have made my peace with that. A man who leaves does not get to be remembered kindly, and I do not ask to be. But I need you to know one thing, in case you ever hold this. In case the mountains are stranger than I believe, and someday you find your way here, I did not stop loving you the day I left. I want to tell you why I went. Your mother and I could not live in the same house without doing damage to each other, and to you. And a child raised in that house learns the wrong lessons about what love sounds like. I thought you would be safer with the quiet. I still think it. I wrote you, understand that. I wrote you every year on your birthday. I sent the letters to the only address I had. They came back, all of them. Returned to sender, in your mother's hand. I am not telling you this to make you hate her. She was frightened, and frightened people build walls, and she built hers out of you. I understand it. I forgive it. I only need you to know that the silence was not mine. I was never silent. I was only unheard. I took your atlas the day I left. I know that was a small theft from a small girl, but I could not carry a photograph of a face that would grow and change. I could carry the thing your hands had touched, the thing you loved, because you would trace the green places with your finger and tell your mother you were looking at where you would live someday.
I have thought about that sentence for 13 years, Cora.
Because I think you were looking at here. I think you were looking at this exact place, and neither of us knew it. If you are reading this, you were always right. And I am sorry I could not be here to open the door. The mountains will take care of you now. They took care of me, your father, Silas. The light was gone. Cora sat in the full dark of the cabin, the letter in her lap, and she made a sound she had not made since she was a child. A low, cracked, broken sound. The sound of 60 years of a lie coming apart all at once. Some people just aren't built for staying. Her mother had said it, and Cora had believed it, and she had built her whole life on it. She had believed abandonment was in her blood. She had stood at a door with her keys in her fist when Delphine was 4 years old and burning with fever, and she had heard her mother's voice in her head, and she had almost. She had spent 40 years being half a mother because she believed she was the daughter of a man who left, and it was a lie. He wrote every year, he wrote every single year. And the letters came back, returned to sender, in her mother's hand. The silence was not his, the silence was Marin's, and Marin was 30 years dead and could not answer for it, could not explain, could not be screamed at or wept at or forgiven. She had taken it with her into the ground. 7 words, and a wall built out of her own daughter. Cora pressed the letter to her chest, the way she had pressed the atlas, and she grieved a man she had never met, and a mother who had lied to her, and a daughter she had failed for reasons she had only just learned were false. She grieved all of it at once, because grief does not wait its turn. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough that the cold got into her bones. Long enough that the practical woman she had always also been, the one who filtered water and kicked steps into ice, finally spoke up. You will freeze, that woman said. Get up. Build a fire. Grieve where it's warm, so she got up. She built a small fire in the stone fireplace, used a handful of the 50-year-old kindling from a box beside the hearth. It caught fast, dry as bone, 53 years dry, and the light of it filled the cabin and warmed the room where her father had warmed himself for 13 winters. She sat in one of the 2 old chairs, and she watched the fire, and she held the atlas in her lap, and for the first time, she did not feel alone in the cabin. She felt like she was sitting with him. She slept that night on the floor by the fire, and she dreamed she was 8 years old on a kitchen floor, and a tall shape stood in the doorway, and this time it did not leave. Morning came pale and clear. Cora woke stiff and sore and older than she'd felt in years, and somehow, underneath all of it, lighter, like something heavy she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there had been set down in the night. She looked at the money on the floor and the letters on the desk, and the maps in the open cabinet, and she made a decision that surprised her. She was going to stay. Not for the money. The money she barely thought about, except that as a thing that made staying possible. She was going to stay because her father had walked 14 miles to find a place worth loving, and she had walked 14 miles to find him, and she was not ready to walk back the other way. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The mountains had chosen her, and she chose back. So she went to work. She found the spring first, 200 feet north, behind a boulder shaped, unmistakably, like a turtle. She cupped her hands and drank. It tasted faintly of stone. It had never once run dry, he'd written, and she believed him. She found the woodshed, half collapsed, but under the standing half, cords of firewood, lodgepole, split and stacked 53 years ago by a man's careful hands, dry as bone, ready to burn, and she found the tower. She stood at the base of it a long time before she climbed. 60 feet of weathered wood, a ladder up the leg, a few rungs missing, and she was 68. And a fall from that tower would be the last thing. But she was Silas Hartley's daughter. She had only just learned it, and she had a whole life of not being that to make up for. She climbed, slow, testing every rung, not looking down at the top. A small glassed cab, 10 feet square, a chair fallen on its side. A pair of old binoculars on a hook. Cora stood the chair upright, and she sat in it, where he had sat, and she looked out. And the world stopped her cold, 80 miles of it. Mountains in every direction, peak beyond peak, the far ones dusted with snow, the near ones green with new spring, and no roads, no buildings, no power lines, nothing a human hand had ever made. Just the world, the way it had been for 10,000 years before anyone built anything in it. Her father had sat in this chair and looked at this exact view for 13 years, and Cora understood, finally in her body, why a man might love a place so much he could not imagine leaving it. She sat there a long time, and she did not cry. She was done crying for now. She just looked, and let the looking fill her up. The days that followed ran together the way good hard days do. She scrubbed the floors on her old knees with water hauled from the spring. She scraped the grime off the windows. She swept 53 years of dust from every surface until the cabin looked less like a tomb and more like a room where a person could live. She cleaned the cook stove, found the firebox whole and the damper working. She lit her first fire in the wood stove on the third night. Used his 50-year-old wood. It caught immediately, and the cabin filled with heat and the good smell of wood smoke. And she sat in his chair by the stove and thought about the man who'd stacked that wood half a century before, never knowing his daughter would burn it. Or maybe knowing, somehow, the way he'd known to write her name on an envelope. She stopped trying to explain that part. Some things you let stay strange. The supply runs began about 2 weeks in, 14 miles down to the trailhead. A bicycle she'd bought in Ledger and stashed. The bike to the parking area. The shuttle into town. And she'd eat at Opal's. The first few visits, Opal just fed her and watched. Made the patty melt without being asked by the third time. Then slow, the way careful people do, Opal started asking, "Where'd you come from? What's it like up there, alone?" And Cora answered some and not others. But on her 5th visit, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee going cold, Cora asked a question of her own. "You ever hear anything about the ranger? The one who disappeared?" Opal went still, just for a second. But Cora saw it. "Silas Hartley," Opal said. "Careful. Like the name had weight, that's the one." Opal set down the rag, and something moved behind her eyes. Doing math. The same math Walt had done in the truck. "Why do you ask?" Han and Cora, who had spent 60 years not saying things, said it because he was my father. The diner was empty. Just the two of them. The clock ticking on the wall, Opal came around the counter, and she sat on the stool beside Cora, and she took Cora's old hand in both of hers. "I wondered," Opal said quietly, "when Walt said you'd gone up there. Something in my chest just wondered." She squeezed Cora's hand. "You've got his jaw. Same stubborn set." Cora's eyes stung. "Did you know him?" "No, he was gone 8 years before I got here, but this town never stopped talking about him. A man doesn't just vanish. Not clean like that. It leaves a hole, and a town keeps poking at a hole for 50 years. What did they say?" Opal was quiet a moment. "Different things. Depends who you ask." She hesitated. "But you want to know who actually knew him. Who was actually here when it happened?" "Who?" "Walt." Cora went cold. Walt Raddick was a young ranger back then. Worked under Hartley. Learned the trails from him. She looked at Cora hard. "And Walt has never, in 53 years, said one word about that winter. Not one. Man will talk your ear off about weather and elk. But you say Hartley to him and he goes quiet as a grave." She squeezed Cora's hand again. "If anybody knows what happened to your father, it's Walt." Cora walked out of that diner into the cold spring afternoon, and she looked up at the mountains. Her father was up there somewhere, his bones under 53 winters of snow and fallen wood. And a man was alive. Right now. In this town. Who knew where Walt Raddick, who had told her the name at all? He hadn't had to. He could have driven her to the trailhead and never let on whose cabin it was. But he'd said the name. Silas Hartley. Like a door left open a crack. like a man who'd carried something 53 years, and was tired of carrying it, and was waiting for someone with the right to take it from him. Cora meant to go to Walt that week. She swore she would. Except that was the week the money changed things, not her life. Her life was already what she wanted it to be. But the money changed the edges of it. She'd inventoried the maps by then. Careful. Everyone, and a few of them were extraordinary museum pieces, worth more than the 40,000 in the bags. She wrote to a map dealer in the nearest city, sent photographs of 6 she was willing to part with, and a week later he wrote back $11,000. For 6 maps she accepted. The check came, care of the general store. She opened a small account at a small bank where nobody asked a gray-haired woman hard questions, and she bought things: a solar panel, a little radio, better food, and books, so many books. Each one carried 14 miles on her back, each one earned, and that was the mistake. Because a woman with dirt under her nails does not open a bank account with $11,000 in a town of 116 people. Without somebody noticing, and somebody noticed. His name was Merle Cutter. Cora didn't know him yet, wouldn't for another week, but she'd feel the change before she saw the man. The way you feel weather change before the sky does. Merle Cutter was 50-something, lean and hard and gone to seed. He'd grown up 2 valleys over, and he'd grown up on a story. His grandfather had been a ranger, and that grandfather had told his father, and his father had told him, a story that had rotted in the family like a bad tooth for 3 generations. The story of the ranger who vanished, and the money everyone swore he'd left up in that cabin. A ranger's fortune, sitting in the mountains, waiting. Merle had gone looking, twice, in his 20s. Never found the cabin. Trail wasn't on any map. Nearly died the second time in an early snow. Gave it up. Told himself it was a fairy tale, until a gray-haired woman walked into the bank in Ledger and opened an account with $11,000 in cash and a check from a map dealer. Maps. And something in his chest that had been asleep for 30 years sat straight up, because there was only one place a broke old woman gets $11,000 in rare maps. And she'd bought a cabin for $10. Everybody was talking about it. The strange old woman living up at Hartley's place. Hartley's place. Merle Cutter sat in his truck outside the bank, and he smiled, and it was not a good smile. The fairy tale was real, and some old woman had walked right into the middle of it and started spending it. He knew where the cabin was now. Everyone did. She'd cut a trail right to it. 14 miles. Fresh, easy to follow. All he had to do was wait for the right weather. Because a man who wants to take something from someone remote wants bad weather, wants the roads closed, wants no witnesses and no help and no way for a scream to reach a soul. He looked up at the mountains, at the clouds stacking gray behind the peaks, at the first cold front of the coming autumn pushing down out of the north. Winter was coming early. Everybody said Otso. Merle Cutter said good. Up in the cabin, Cora felt none of it yet. She felt only the days getting shorter. The aspens turning, a few leaves at a time, then all at once, a whole hillside gone to fire. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Purpose. She spent those autumn weeks getting ready. She cut and split and stacked wood until her shoulders screamed. She weatherproofed every gap. She hauled in food, trip after trip, until the pantry was full and the snow could come whenever it wanted. And every trip down, she meant to find Walt. And every trip down, she lost her nerve, because as long as she didn't ask, her father was a mystery, a man who might somehow still be out there. But if she asked, and Walt told her, then her father would just be bones, in a specific place, and she'd have to go stand over them, and it would be real and final. And she was 68 years old, and she had only just found him, and she was not ready to bury him, so she didn't ask. Not yet. She was up on the cabin roof the day the first real snow came, clearing needles from around the chimney, when she saw the front come in over the western pass, a gray wall, sliding down the sky, swallowing the peaks one by one. She climbed down, and she stood in the clearing and watched it come. And the first flakes fell, fat and slow, and then faster, and the world began to go white and soft and silent around her. And she did not know that 2 valleys over, a man was watching the same storm come in, and smiling, and loading a pack. She did not know that the letters weren't the last secret the mountains were holding. She did not know that Walt Radek, in a small house in Ledger, was sitting at his kitchen table that same afternoon, looking at an old photograph of two young rangers on a porch step. One of them Silas Hartley, and thinking, for the 10,000th time, that he was going to have to tell somebody the truth before he died, and that maybe. Finally, the right somebody had come. Cora tipped her face up into the falling snow, and she smiled, because she thought she understood her story now. Abandoned girl. Lied to for 60 years. Come home at last to a father who loved her all along. She thought the twist was over. She thought she knew everything. She knew almost nothing. And winter closed its hand around the mountain. The first snow that fell the day Cora stood in the clearing did not stop. It fell all that night, and the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, there was 2 feet on the ground, and the world had gone utterly, completely silent. The kind of silence Cora had never known. Not the quiet of a sleeping house, not the hush of a library after closing. This was the silence of a world that had stopped moving, where nothing happened, where time itself seemed to freeze, along with the creak and the ground and the breath in your chest. Some days she did not speak a word out loud. Some days she went from waking to sleeping and never once heard a human voice, not even her own. And the silence pressed in, the way water fills a sinking boat, slow, and then all at once, in the 3rd week she caught herself talking, cooking beans on the stove, narrating it, adding the salt now, needs more water. Almost there, she stopped, startled by her own voice in the empty room. Then she kept going, because a human voice, even her own, pushed back against the silence, reminded her she was still here, still thinking, still alive, and soon she was talking to him, not out loud, not exactly, in her head. She told her father about her day, about the fox that crossed the clearing at dawn, a red flame against the white. She asked him the questions he could not answer. Why did you stay when you knew it would kill you? Was the quiet worth your life? And in the fire and the wood and the worn spots on the door handle where his hand had rested 10,000 times, she almost heard him answer. Yes, the cabin said, every night. Yes, she had food. She had wood. Barely enough, she'd have to be careful. She had her father's chair and her father's fire and her father's view. She was alone. But she was not lonely. There is a difference. Cora had lived 68 years to learn it. Loneliness is wanting company you don't have. She did not want company. She had the mountains. She had the fox and the great gray owl that made no sound at all when it flew. She had the ghost of a man who'd loved her the whole time. She had more company than she'd had in years, except 2 valleys over. A man was coming. Merle Cutter had waited for weather, and the mountain had given it to him. He waited until the first hard front settled in, until the roads were closing and the 14 miles had turned from difficult into impossible. Impossible for help, not impossible for a man who'd hunted these hills his whole life. Who knew now, finally, exactly where the cabin was, because the old woman had cut a trail right to it. He waited for the storm to break, and then he loaded his pack. And he started up. He did not tell a soul, because a man who means to take something from someone remote does not tell a soul. Up in the cabin, Cora slept, and she did not know he was coming, but the mountain knew, and it had one more thing to show her first. The worst night came in the last week of the year. She woke in the dark to a smell, not the good smell, not the wood smoke she'd grown to love. A different smell, thick, acrid, wrong. She sat up on the cot, and even in the dark she saw it. The cabin was filling with smoke, not the thin wisp that leaked when the damper wasn't right. Thick gray clouds, rolling across the ceiling, blotting out the one candle on the table. The chimney blocked. She'd cleaned it in the fall, but something had happened. A clump of snow melted and refrozen at the cap, a dam of ice, and the fire was still burning and the smoke had nowhere to go, and it was backing up, into the room, into her lungs, faster every second. Cora threw off the blankets. And here is the thing about being 68 in a smoke-filling cabin 14 miles from the nearest road. You do not have time to be 68. Her eyes streamed, her lungs seized. She could not see. She stumbled to the stove and hauled the damper shut, cutting the air to the fire. The flames sank. But the smoke kept coming, and the room was gray and getting grayer, and the air was gone. Out, she had to get out. Where there was air. She jammed her feet into unlaced boots, grabbed the coat off the hook, and she shoved the door open and fell out onto the porch into the killing cold. And the cold hit her like a wall, 30 below. Maybe colder. The air so cold it froze the tears on her cheeks. and turned the wet in her nose to ice. She gasped and it burned her throat all the way down. But it was clean, it was air. She looked back at the cabin. Smoke poured from every crack, rose up in a gray column into the black sky, lit from below by the dying orange of the fire. And she understood, standing there, shaking, if she hadn't woken, if her old body hadn't jolted her up at exactly the right moment. She'd have breathed that smoke until she stopped. She'd have died in her sleep, in her father's cabin, and no one would have found her until spring, the same as him. Nearly, and something in her that had been soft with grief for weeks went suddenly. Perfectly. Hard, because she was not going to die tonight, because she was Silas Hartley's daughter, and she was not going to lie down in his cabin and quit. She was going to fix it. She went to the woodshed and fought the drifted snow to the door, and she found the long metal pole she'd used to clean the chimney in the fall. And she carried it back through snow to her knees, and she climbed up onto the porch rail. From there onto the roof. The green metal roof, pitched steep to shed snow, now sheathed in ice under a foot of powder. Slick as glass, in the dark, in 30 below. At 68 years old, she moved on her hands and knees. She dug the pole in for balance. Her fingers went numb in minutes. Her feet screamed in the open boots. Every foot of that roof wanted to throw her off it into the dark and the snow in the end. She did not let it. She reached the chimney. A great clot of snow and ice sealed the cap. The fire's heat had melted the middle, and the meltwater had frozen around the rim and made a plug no smoke could pass. She raised the pole, and she swung it at the ice. The shock jarred up her arms into her old shoulders, but the ice cracked. She swung again and again, because she would not die tonight. Because she had a father to bury and a daughter to call, and a life she had only just started to want. Because the mountain did not care whether she lived. But she cared. For the first time in years. She cared. Chunks of ice flew off into the black. The cap broke loose. She drove the pole down the flue, breaking the plug, and a gust of trapped smoke rushed up past her face, and she heard the fire below roar back to life as the air finally began to move. She climbed down. She went inside. The smoke was clearing already. The fire burned bright and hungry. And Cora stood in the middle of her father's cabin and shook. Not from the cold, from how close it had been. She built the fire up. She made coffee and drank it black and scalding. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned. And she understood a thing she had not fully understood before. This place was not safe. It did not love her. It would not mourn her if she died on that roof in the dark. The mountains did not love anybody. But she loved them. And that was the bargain. You loved a place not because it loved you back. You loved it because it was worth loving. And you accepted the risk. And if it took you someday, well, that was part of the deal too. Her father had understood that. He'd made the same bargain, and the mountain had collected. She looked into the fire and she thought, enough being afraid of the answer. She had survived the mountain's worst tonight. She had earned the truth. As soon as the weather broke, she was going to find Walt Raddick and make him tell her where her father was. She did not have to wait, because the truth was already coming up the mountain to find her. Merle Cutter reached the cabin 2 days later, just after dark. The storm had eased to a hard, steady snow. He came out of the trees at the edge of the clearing, and he stood in the dark and looked at the gold light in the cabin windows, and the smoke rising straight from the chimney. She was home good. He'd rehearsed it the whole way up. Old woman, alone, 14 miles from help. He didn't even necessarily have to hurt her. Just scare her, just make her hand it over. The money, the maps, it was his, by the story, by 3 generations of a family that had earned it in the telling. He crossed the clearing, boots crunching in the snow, and Cora heard it because a woman who has spent a winter in absolute silence. Hears everything. Hears a boot in snow from 50 feet. Hears wrong before she knows why it's wrong. She was at the stove, and she went still, and she listened. A boot, another, coming toward the porch, too heavy for the owl, too two-legged for the fox, too deliberate for the wind. A person 14 miles up, in a closing storm. There was no good reason for a person. Cora's mind did the thing minds do. Fast and stupid and panicked all at once. A hiker in trouble. Somebody lost. Somebody except who, except nobody hikes this in this. Except the bank, except the maps, except she'd been careless, and she knew it in a flash. Careless with the account and the maps and the story in a town that ran on stories. The boots hit the porch steps, and Cora Vance did not freeze, 68 years old, alone, and she did not freeze, because she had kicked steps into ice above a 200-foot drop, because she had broken a chimney plug on a roof in 30 below, because she was done being afraid. She reached out, and she turned down the lamp, and the cabin went dark, and she moved, the door handle turned, the door pushed inward, and a shape filled the doorway. Tall, broad, a stranger, snow on his shoulders, and a voice that tried for friendly and landed on something else. "Evening, ma'am. Sorry to trouble you. Got turned around in the storm. Silence, ma'am. Saw your light. Sure could use to warm up, and from the dark, from somewhere off to his left. Not where he expected. An old woman's voice, level, cold, steady as stone. There's no light. You watch it go out." Cutter turned to the voice now. "No need to. You came up 14 miles in a storm. For a warm-up." A pause. "Try again." He couldn't see her. That was the thing. She'd killed the lamp, and she knew this room in the dark, and he didn't. He was blind in here, and she was not. And that changed everything. "Look." His voice dropped to friendly. "I know what's in here. Everybody knows. The Ranger's money. It ain't yours, lady. My family, your family, what? You just hand it over. And I walk out. And nobody, you walk out," Cora said, "the way you came. Now, before the cold does the deciding for both of us." And he lunged toward the voice. Except the voice had already moved, because Cora had spent a winter learning every foot of that floor in the dark. And Merle Cutter had spent about 90 seconds. He crashed into the heavy table she'd known was there, and he hadn't. Caught it across the hip. Swore, stumbled. And in the dark and the pain he lost the door, lost the wall, lost which way was out. And Cora was at the stove, where the cast-iron skillet hung on its nail, right where her hand knew to find it. She did not think of it as a weapon. She thought of it as the last hard thing between her and a man who'd climbed a mountain to take what her father left her. He found her by her breathing, came at her low, and she swung the skillet. And she was 68 and not strong the way he was strong. But she did not need to be. She only needed one good swing in the dark, and she'd been swinging a splitting maul all autumn. And there was more iron in her arms than a man like Merle Cutter would ever guess. It caught him across the shoulder and the side of the head. And he went down into the dark hard, taking a chair with him. Cora did not wait to see if he'd get up. She was already at the door, out into the snow, because she could not fight him in there forever, an old woman against a hard man. But out here she had the one thing he did not. Out here she knew the mountain, and he did not. She went off the porch and into the trees at the clearing's edge, into the dark she knew, moving low and quiet the way she'd learned 50 years ago, and she stopped behind a deadfall and waited. And Cutter came stumbling out, bleeding, furious, cursing her into the storm. "There's nowhere to go, lady. 14 miles, you'll freeze out here same as me," and that was his mistake. Saying it out loud because it was true for him, and not for her. He didn't have shelter. His plan had been the cabin, the warmth, the quick score. And now he was bleeding, in 30 below, in the dark at 7,000 feet. And the cold was already reaching into him. She could hear it, the slur creeping into the curses, the stumble in the steps. The mountain was already deciding. Cora stayed behind the deadfall. Cold, but not dying. She knew how to not die out here. He didn't, and all she had to do was wait. He crashed around the clearing calling for her. Then not calling, just crashing, then just moving, and then, after a long time, in the falling snow. He sat down in the snow, and Cora knew what that meant. Anyone who knew cold knew what that meant. When the cold gets deep enough, a man gets warm, feels warm, wants to sit, wants to sleep, and she had a choice. She could let him. God help her, part of her wanted to. She could stay behind the deadfall and let the mountain collect him the way it had collected her father, and walk back into the cabin in the morning and never tell a soul. Except she was Silas Hartley's daughter, and her father had buried the dead from 3 search and rescue operations. Her father had loved this brutal place and kept faith with it. And the faith you kept with a place like this was that you did not let a man die in the snow. Not even a bad one, not even one who'd come to rob you. The mountain didn't care, but you did. That was the whole bargain. That was the only thing that separated you from the mountain. Damn it, Cora whispered into the dark. To herself, to him, to her father, and she got up from behind the deadfall. She got him up. She could not carry him, but she could bully him. She'd bullied a lot of things in 68 years. She got a shoulder under his arm and walked him, cursing and slurring and half-conscious, back across the clearing, not into the cabin. She wasn't a fool. She put him in the woodshed, out of the wind, and she brought him blankets and built a small fire in a metal bucket and wrapped his hands. And she did not until dawn take her eyes off him, or the skillet out of her reach, and she thought, watching him shiver back to life in the firelight, what a strange, hard thing, to save the man who came to kill you, because a dead man taught you to, and he isn't even here, except maybe he was. Walt Raddick came up the mountain the next morning. Cora saw him from the porch, a dark figure breaking the tree line on skis, the old smooth stride of a man who'd been doing it for 60 years. He'd seen the weather break at dawn. He'd had a bad feeling in his chest for 3 days. He'd waited 53 years to climb this trail, and something had finally driven him up it. He came into the clearing, and he stopped, and he looked at the cabin, and the woodshed, and the tracks in the snow, and the story they told, which he read in a glance. "You all right?" he called. "I am," Cora called back. "He's not." She nodded at the shed, came up in the storm. For the money, Walt skied over, looked in the shed at Merle Cutter, gray and shaking under the blankets, looked at the bucket fire, looked at the skillet still in Cora's hand. "You do that," Walt said, nodding at the goose egg on Cutter's head. "I did, and then you saved his life. I did that too." Walt looked at Cora Vance for a long moment, and something in his weathered old face broke open. Something he'd held shut for 53 years. "You're just like him," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "God Almighty. You're just like your father." And Cora set the skillet down. "Walt," she said, "it's time. You tell me. Everything. Right now they got Cutter stable first." Walt radioed down that a rescue would come for him when the road opened in a day, maybe 2. The man wasn't going to die, which was more than he'd earned. And then Walt and Cora sat in the cabin, in the 2 old chairs, by the fire, her father's chairs, her father's fire, and Walt Raddick finally told the truth. "I was 22, he said. "Green as spring grass. He trained me, Silas, taught me the trails, taught me how to read a mountain. He stared into the fire. Best man I ever knew, and the loneliest. Tell me about the winter." Walt was quiet a long time. The service was closing the station. They offered him the desk in the city. He turned it down. Said he'd take the Alaska posting instead. Walt shook his head slow. And I believed him. God help me, I was 22, and I believed him. Because I wanted to, but it wasn't true. No, Walt's jaw worked. He was sick, Cora. The word landed in the room like a stone. Sick, she said. He'd been to a doctor in the city that fall. Only time in 13 years he left the mountain. And he came back gray. Walt's eyes were wet now, an old man's eyes holding 53 years. Something in his gut, the kind they couldn't fix. Not then. He had months. Bad months. The kind that end in a hospital bed with tubes and strangers, and white walls and a window looking out on a parking lot. Cora's hand was at her mouth, and your father looked at that. A hospital bed, 200 miles from the only place he loved. Strangers. Machines. Dying slow in a room with no sky. He shook his head, and he looked at the mountain, and he made a choice. He stayed. He stayed. Walt's voice was barely there, he told me, the night before. Just me. He said, "Walt, I'm not going to Alaska. I'm not going to any hospital. I'm going up the ridge. And I'm going to sit down and look at the whole world one last time. And I'm going to let the cold take me the easy way, before the sickness takes me the hard way." The fire popped in the silence, and he asked me, Walt said, and now the tears ran freely down the old creases of his face. He asked me not to look for him. Not to let them find him, he said. Let them think I went to Alaska. Give me that. Let me disappear into the one place that was ever mine, and I kept his secret. Walt looked at her. Wrecked. 53 years. I told the search parties I had no idea. I let this whole town believe he abandoned his post, because the truth was his, and he asked me to keep it. Every year of my life I've carried it. Every single year. He wiped his face with a rough hand, and then a gray-haired woman gets off a bus, with his jaw and his walk, and she buys Kevin for $10. And I knew. In the truck. I knew who you were before you did. His voice broke again, and I've been waiting ever since, to see if I finally had somebody I was allowed to tell. Cora sat very still. 53 years she had believed one lie, that her father left because he wasn't built for staying. And then she'd learned a second truth, that he'd loved her all along, written every year, been silenced by her mother. And now, the third truth, the deepest one. Her father hadn't abandoned anyone. Not her, not his post, not the world. He had been a dying man, who chose to die on his own terms, in the one place he loved. Looking at the whole world one last time, he hadn't run from life. He'd walked, with his eyes open, into a death he could bear, and the mountain had kept him, the way he asked. For 53 years. Where? Cora said, her voice a thread. Where is he? Walt. Walt stood. I'll show you, he said. It's why I came up. I think I've been climbing this mountain in my head for 53 years. I just didn't know I was waiting to bring his own girl. They went up the ridge behind the tower. It was a hard climb, on the snow, for two old people, but they went slow and careful, and neither was going to stop. Walt broke trail on the skis, and Cora came behind in his track, and the sun came out, thin and cold and bright, and lit the whole white world up until it hurt to look at. There was a place near the top of the ridge, a flat granite shelf, higher than the tower, closer to the sky, and there, against the base of a great weathered boulder, sheltered from the worst of the wind, half reclaimed by 53 years of moss and lichen and slow mountain time, was a man, what was left of a man, bone and weathered cloth in the quiet dignity of a long returning to the earth, sitting, back against the stone, facing out, facing the whole world, the way he'd said he would, and beside him, in an old tin box, Walt uncovered from the snow with shaking hands, wrapped against the ears, a journal. Walt had known it was here. He'd come once, that first spring, when the snow melted, and found his friend, and left him exactly as he wished, and taken nothing, and told no one, except he'd seen the journal, and he'd left it, because it wasn't his to read. He wrote to the end, Walt said quietly. I saw that much. Couldn't read it, couldn't, but I saw he wrote to the end. Cora knelt in the snow beside her father's bones, and she was not afraid, and she was not horrified. She had thought she would be. But it was not horror she felt. It was peace, because he was home. He had gotten what he wanted. He had died looking at the thing he loved, not in a white room, not among strangers, here under the whole sky. In his own mountains, she took off her glove, and she put her old bare hand against the cold stone beside him. Hi, Dad, she said. It was the first time in her life she had ever said the word to him, and the wind moved through the trees below, and a raven called somewhere out across the valley, and Cora Vance sat with her father at last at the top of the world. She opened the journal that night, by the fire. Alone, it was 13 years of it, and then the final weeks, and she did not read it all at once. She would read it for years to come, a little at a time, the way you ration something precious. But she read the last entry that first night. He'd written it up on the ridge, she could tell. The hand grown shaky, the pencil faint. A man at the very end, and it said, in part, the thing she would carry for the rest of her days. I am looking at the whole world, it said, and I am not afraid. I have loved this place enough for one life, and that is more than most men get. My only sorrow is my daughter. Cora, I never knew her. I hope she had a good life. I hope someone loved her the way I could not. I hope wherever she is, she found her own mountain, and if there is justice in this strange world, any at all, maybe someday she will find this one. The mountains chose me once. Maybe they will choose her too. I would like that. I would like that very much. Cora closed the journal, and she sat by the fire for a long time, and then she got up, and she went to the desk, and she took out paper, and she began, for the first time in 2 years, to write a letter of her own. Spring came slow to the mountain. The snow went inch by inch, retreating up the slopes. The creek broke free of its ice. The birds came back and filled the mornings with a racket that felt, after that silent winter, like a celebration. Cora came out of the cabin, like a woman coming out of a long illness, thinner, grayer. And underneath all of it, somehow new, Merle Cutter had been carried out weeks before, when the road opened, alive and frostbit and facing charges, though Cora, in the end, asked them to go easy. A man raised on a rotten story, she said, is a kind of victim too. Walt looked at her strange when she said it, like she'd said something her father would have said, which she had. She made her first trip to town in April, 14 miles down, 2 days on the trail. Opal was behind the counter when she walked in. She looked up, and came around fast and took Cora's hands in both of hers. I didn't know, Opal said. If you'd made it, I made it. You look different. How Opal thought about it, and her eyes went bright, like you know something now that you didn't know before. I do, Cora said. And then she did the thing she had come to town to do. She had a letter to mail. She'd written it on the desk under the front window, by the light her father used to write by, and it was the hardest thing she'd ever written. Harder than surviving the winter. Harder than the roof in 30 below. It was to her daughter, to Delphine, dear Del. It began, I have spent your whole life being half a mother, and I need to tell you why. And then I need to tell you I'm sorry. And then, if you'll let me, I need to tell you what I found. She wrote it all. The lie her mother told, the way she'd believed it. The way she'd stood at the door with the keys in her fist, and Del was 4 and burning with fever. And how she'd been half-gun ever since, believing it was in her blood. And then she wrote the truth, that it was never in her blood. That her father wrote every year and was silenced. That he loved her the whole time. That he died on a ridge looking at the whole world. And his last sorrow was a daughter he never knew. The chain of it, Del, she wrote, do you see it? He was made to look like he left. So I grew up believing leaving was in me, so I half left you, so you learned to keep your distance from me. 3 generations, all of us walking away from each other, and all of it built on a lie a frightened woman told 60 years ago. I want to break it. I'm too old to fix all of it, but I can break it, right here. With this letter, I found a place, Del. Your grandfather's place. It's the most beautiful place in the world, and I want you to see it before I'm gone. And I want you to bring Junie. She'd only met her granddaughter twice. A teenager now. A girl she barely knew. Bring Junie, Cora wrote. Because Opal tells me your girl loves maps. She stopped writing when she wrote that. Because her hand shook too badly to go on. Junie loved maps, just like Cora, just like Silas. A girl 3 generations down, tracing green spaces with her finger. Looking at where she was going to live someday, the blood ran true. Not the leaving. The leaving was the lie. The real thing that ran in the blood was this. The love of the empty places. The pull of the far country. The atlas on the floor. It skipped nobody. It had come all the way down. Cora finished the letter, and she mailed it to an address she wasn't even sure was current. And she went back up the mountain, and she waited. The way the mountains wait. Patient. For as long as it takes. The answer came in June. A hiker brought it up. A young woman, one of the few who found the old trail now, carrying a letter given to her by the diner owner in Ledger. Cora's hands shook so hard she nearly couldn't open it. It was short. Delphine had never been one for words. She'd gotten that from Cora, who'd gotten it from a man who could only ever say things in careful, blocky letters years too late. Mom, it said. I read it 4 times, and I cried all 4. And I don't know how to fix 40 years in a letter either, but I want to try. We're coming, Junie and me. As soon as school's out, she wants to see Grandpa's maps. She hasn't stopped talking about it since I told her. She says she's always wanted to see where the roads run out. Cora sat on the porch of her father's cabin, in the long gold light of a mountain evening, and read those words. And she wept. And this time the weeping had no grief in it at all. They came in July. Cora walked down to meet them at the trailhead, because 14 miles is a lot for a woman who never hikes and a girl who never has. She walked it with them, slow, over 2 days. And she watched her daughter's face when they crested the pass, and the whole world opened up. And she watched something in Del, some not 40 years old, just begin, to loosen. And Junie was 15. All elbows and opinions and a stubborn set to her jaw that Cora knew. That Cora had seen in a soft gray photograph, that Walt had seen when he looked at her in a truck and knew who she was. The jaw ran true too. Junie walked into the cabin, and she saw the maps laid out on the great table, and she made a sound Cora understood in her bones, a sound of pure hunger, the hunger for the far places, and Cora took down from the shelf the oldest thing she owned. A road atlas, spine split, pages soft as cloth, a child's name in the front in a child's blocky hand. Cora, this was mine, she told her granddaughter, when I was littler than you. And your great-grandfather carried it his whole life. She put it in the girl's hands. It's yours now. And Junie opened it and bent over it and traced one finger across the green spaces, the national forests, the wilderness, the empty places that don't belong to anybody. And Cora looked at her daughter and her granddaughter and the maps and the fire in the stove her father built, and the tower out the window her father climbed, and the whole impossible thread of it, 4 generations pulled taut, across 60 years and 14 miles in one enormous lie. Finally, holding that autumn, before the snow, she wrote her own letter. She typed it, on the last of her father's letterhead because it felt right, and she put it in the leather portfolio with his. And she wrote at the top, "To the next person who finds this cabin." She wrote about the trail and the roof and the chimney and the spring behind the turtle-shaped boulder. She passed on everything her father had passed to her, and she wrote about the money, most of it still in the bags, because she'd found she needed almost none of it to live the only way she wanted to live. And she wrote, "I am leaving it for whoever comes next, the way it was left for me. My father trusted the mountains to choose, and they chose me, though it took them 53 years. And I was worth the wait after all. I have a granddaughter now. She loves the maps the way I did, the way he did. Someday this cabin will be hers, if she wants it. And if she doesn't, if the mountains have someone else in mind, then it will be theirs. I have learned the thing my father knew. You do not own these places. They own you. And the best you can do is be worthy of them for as long as they let you stay." She signed it Cora Vance, and under her name she wrote the date, and under the date she added one line more. "For anyone. For no one. For him it was the best $10 I ever spent." She climbed the tower one last time before the first snow, slow, careful, old knees. She'd done it 100 times now, and it never got easier, and it never got less worth it. At the top she sat in the chair, her father's chair, and she looked out at the whole world. The aspens had gone to gold in the meadow. The far peaks wore the first white. A raven called, once, and the sound carried clean across the valley and faded into a silence that was not empty anymore. Not to her. She thought about the girl on the kitchen floor, tracing green spaces, telling her mother she was looking at where she'd live someday. Her mother had thought it was a phase. It was not a phase. She thought about the tall shape in the doorway, there, and then not there, and how she'd spent 60 years believing he wasn't built for staying, when the truth was he'd stayed longer than any of them. She stayed right here, for 53 years, facing the world, waiting for her. She thought about Dell, down in the cabin, learning slow how to be her mother's daughter again, and Junie, with the atlas tracing the far country with a finger that had traveled 60 years and 4 generations to reach that exact page, the chain broken and reforged into something whole. Cora Vance was 68 years old, and once she had been homeless with $10 in her coat. And she had spent it on a ranger station 14 miles from the nearest road. And she had found $40,000 in a metal cabinet, and 2 letters from a dead man, and the truth about her whole life. And her father at last, on a ridge with the world in front of him. And she had found the thing she'd been tracing on maps since she was 8 years old. Not a place, a way home. The sun went down over the western peaks, gold to orange to red to the deep blue of coming dark. And the first stars came out over the eastern ridge, the same stars a girl had watched from a kitchen window 60 years before. And Cora sat in the tower in the last of the light, and she was small and temporary and unimportant and part of it. Part of all of the rock and the water and the cold, and the light and the long unbroken love that runs, quiet and stubborn and hidden, down through the generations of a family, whether they know it or not. Down in the cabin, the windows glowed gold against the dark. Smoke rose straight from the chimney into the still evening air. Home. She climbed down from the tower as the stars came out, and she walked back across the clearing toward the light, toward her daughter, toward her granddaughter, toward the fire. And behind her, the mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping watch over the little cabin in the clearing, the cabin where a man had lived and loved and chosen his own ending. The cabin where his daughter had come home 60 years too late and exactly on time. The cabin that would stand for another 50 years, or 100, or 1,000 waiting, patient, for whoever the mountains chose next.